So it's taken decades to. I mean, I'm one of the things about this, about Angelina Jolie in general, and about. I'm not a huge Angelina Jolie fan. I'm not a big Charlize Theron fan. But at the same time, what these women have done, and people like Kate Winslet, not Kate Winslet, pardon me, although I think Kate Winslet is a really fine actor, but and she, I think, has done a lot to address and really look at how to what the disruption of gender roles is. And she's made some particularly fine films in the last few years. The one in Australia where she's a seamstress is particularly fine. But one of the things about these earlier roles, I guess this is now 15 years ago for Mr. and Mrs. Smith, is that Jolie refuses to be sidelined because of how she looks, and she refuses. She insists on being an action star. She insists on equity, basically, and that means that she insists on killing people and not being a particularly caring killer. She's not like a sweet caring killer. She's a killer, and the same thing is true with most of the other films that she's done. And as I say, Charlize Theron, things like Atomic Blonde. And Fury Road, where she plays Furiosa. The idea, what's important about these movies, whether or not they're really that interesting, because they may be kind of dull. You're like, okay, it's another action movie, and instead of a guy, it's a gal. It's like, okay. But what's important about this is that these women specifically do not offer themselves up as sexual prizes, which are to be claimed. What makes them a prize is that they're adventurers. They are really soldiers of fortune. Okay. But it's taken decades to break this connection between physical strength and masculinity that the one brings about or causes the other, or vice versa. And every time we get a little closer to understanding just how complex gender performance is, there's some 17-year-old who has just made millions of dollars playing a female hero who says something like, I'm not a feminist because I like men. Now, this has improved a great deal, but in a very short time. I mean, 5 years ago, if I asked a class at MIT that was, say, I don't know, 95% female, how many people were feminists? I'd maybe get 3 or 4 hands up. Including if I put my hand up, I'd say, okay, I'm a feminist. How many other people are feminists? And people would kind of be like, yeah, I guess I'm a feminist. It's like, what's to be lost here? What's the cost? If you say you're a feminist, what's going to happen? Boys don't want to date you. Okay, so maybe those boys. Maybe you don't want to be around those boys if they can't take that. Maybe it's So and then Twitter goes wild and there's a big fight, and it's 20 years ago again. So it's only really since Me Too, and then the sort of combination of Me Too, Black Lives Matter. And we haven't come out of COVID, so we'll see what happens in terms of gender as a result of COVID. I'm not sure. It's too early to tell. You just can't. There are things we won't be able to see coming. But some of Anna Vander's war stories are truly appalling, and she dreams of them on page 16, which involves mud oozing through the operation room, the OR walls, and during monsoon season in Vietnam, this does in fact happen, where the hospital is covered with mud and the OR teams operate standing in liquid mud, and she describes this on page 16. But her stories of trying to assist the surgeon who trained her while the hospital is under attack are truly and literally staggering. I mean, they make the characters stagger. And they lower the table closer to the floor, and Carl and I perform the surgery while kneeling on 101. Now, let me just take a reality check here. The concept of performing surgery on anybody is not going to happen as far as I'm concerned. It's like people are going to die. People are going to die. It's like unless it can be done with a stapler, it's not going to happen. But then you're going to have to do this. You're being bombed. The bullets are flying, and you're kneeling. The mind boggles. I really cannot. Yeah, I cannot imagine. So even for women who were at base hospitals, those base hospitals largely didn't come under fire. They still experienced this unending stream of horrifically wounded men, because after all, they were seeing people who had not yet been triaged, and who had not yet, to put it bluntly, who had not yet died of their wounds. So because they were going to be dragged in, and they were, if they were breathing, they brought them in. So they might be, say, as they call them, double traumatic amputations. A traumatic amputation is that you've, say, just lost a limb because it's been blown off. So you had both your legs blown off because you stepped on a mine, but you survived somehow, and people did survive. And in fact, Max Cleland, I'm trying to remember, I think he survived. He has one arm. And he actually ran for Senate, and he was a successful senator for many years. But he has one limb. So, these are terrible wounds to observe and to see. And remember that these haven't happened to people who are, in their 70s or 80s. They've happened to people who are 20 or 18 or 19. So they're young people, your age, younger, So think about your younger brother or sister having this happen to them, right? So the difference between Vietnam and other wars, and this is why it's now important to understand the technology, is because the helicopter, which was so ubiquitous, could actually get a soldier who was alive with these terrible double traumatic or triple traumatic amputations to a hospital room, which they never would have survived to long enough in World War II or Korea. And so that meant that the nurse saw a daily flood of men who were alive, but dying because of, say, third-degree burns, which are going to kill you. I mean, it's unless you're very lucky. Mines or booby trap explosions. And these, as I say, these multiple traumas from basically what are industrial weapons. I mean, this is industrial warfare of the mid to late 20th century. And while these stories show us, if nothing else, that an OR combat nurse is certainly tough, whatever that means, or tougher, really, than any man, it also disposes of the essentialist argument that women, because they can have children, are naturally nurturing and caring and frail and life-directed. It's like, we're not. I mean, we continue to make this assumption, and people make this argument, that women's nature must be this, that because they have a womb, they must be nurturing and they must be protective and all these other things. Like, okay, or not, because this is fundamentally an essentialist argument. And the problem with essentialism is that it's very rigid. So as much as the Army desperately needed to recruit nurses, it also expected them to walk away after the war and shut up about it. And they weren't considered to be veterans, and they weren't entitled to medical care or to the GI Bill for education. Now, many, many millions of soldiers came home and went to school, which they couldn't have afforded to do. That is, when I say they went to school, they went to college or university. Often the same thing in the States, depending on where you go and what state you're in. Which they couldn't have done if they hadn't been, they would have had to work for a living, basically. But the GI Bill would have paid for their classes and allowed them enough money to live, because the cost of living was low, because economy was still riding fairly high until it was beginning to crash in the early 70s. Well, the women didn't get that. So if the women came home, now remember they were nurses, so they probably had a couple of years of nursing school of some kind, but they had to go to work. That was it. I mean, you got home and you weren't getting any supplement from the government. You had to go out and work, and you weren't going to be allowed to go to school on the government bill. And so Vandemander says on page 301, we've been able to show the public that women deserve better treatment. Before we started the Women's Project, the VA, that is the Veterans Administration, had not, in more than half a century of existence, ever published anything that gave the least idea that women were entitled to veterans benefits. Well, why not? There were veterans. There were women veterans all along. The fact that the VA having women soldiers, but refusing to accept it, seemed to go hand in hand with military medicine, which can combine the worst of both worlds. And so now I'm going to turn to that. Okay.